Well, thank you very much, Peter, and Mark and John for the very kind words of welcome. This is a wonderful family gathering, and it's terrific to see and half see people I haven't seen for quite some years. But I do want to, first and foremost, because of the debt we owe to that redoubtable Scottish-descended Australian, Robert Gordon Menzies, I want to acknowledge the presence of members of the Menzies family. He was, without question, not only the greatest political leader this country has had, but he was also the greatest political orator that this country, and indeed many countries, have seen. And one of my proudest recollections of Menzies was in London in January of 1965. I happened to be there when Winston Churchill died. And I don't mind saying that of all the great political figures I've ever studied, he was without question the greatest of all. And not only Australia, but the world owes that remarkable man an enduring debt of gratitude. And I, of course, was just a poor, impoverished lawyer who was making his way around the world on the sort of de rigueur of young Australians then, of going to work in London and surviving there and then doing Europe, as the saying goes. And I happened to be there when Churchill died, and I stood on Ludgate Hill to see the procession go by. I mean, they wouldn't give me a ticket for St Paul's then. I was just a complete unknown. And I remember afterwards I went back to the home of an English family that I'd become very friendly with, and we heard two remarkable speeches from the crypt of St Paul's. One of them was delivered by ex-President Dwight Eisenhower, of course, had been the Commander-in-Chief of the Normandy invasion, which we celebrated only a few weeks ago. And the other was Menzies. And it was a superlative speech. All of the eloquence of which he was capable came through, and I felt so proud. He was my Prime Minister. He was there not representing himself, he was representing his country, Australia. And when it was over, the fellow who owned the house said, "Hey, can we have him?" And I said, "Not a chance, mate." He's too valuable to us and he can be valuable to the world, but his eloquence was extraordinary. And on an occasion like this, we not only give thanks to him, but we also remind ourselves of the enduring values of the Liberal Party, the importance of the individual and not the collective. That is why we as Liberals respect the right of men and women to join or not join trade unions. They have a role in our society, but they don't have a right to strangle our society. We are a party that recognises the supreme value of the family. Family is not only a source of enormous emotional anchorage when we go through difficult times in our lives. We all, nobody in the best ordered of families, we all go through difficulties. And the strength of that family unit is so important. And it not only provides emotional anchorage, but it also happens to be the most efficient social welfare system that mankind has ever devised. Properly functioning families relieve the state of enormous burdens of financial and of another kind. And of course, we believe in free enterprise. We believe very much in the role of small and medium-sized businesses, not to the exclusion of big companies. It's a false war to think there's a difference between, or an argument between small and large. I come of a small business background. I was brought up in that environment where you didn't really like the government. It sort of got in the way. It imposed too many regulations. My father owned a petrol service station, and used to complain about all the licences he had to get and all the paperwork he had to deal with. Just so typical, but it gave me a sense of perspective about the role of small business. And of course, we also grew up, and Menzies led a party that reminded us of the importance of what he called great and powerful friends, the importance of strong alliances. And I look around the room tonight and I think of the contribution that Scott Morrison made as Prime Minister to devising AUKUS, the second most significant security alliance made by this country since World War II, after the ANZUS Treaty. And who was Prime Minister when the ANZUS Treaty was conceived? It was Robert Gordon Menzies. And of course I acknowledge the contribution of Percy Spender and Richard Casey to the development and the prosecution and consummation of that deal. And when I think of Menzies' time in government, and I think of national security, and I think of our relations with the rest of the world, I'm reminded not only of ANZUS and AUKUS, I'm also reminded of the trading relation we now have with Asia. If you listen to the Labor Party, the history of Australia, not only generally speaking, but also with the nations of Asia, started in 1972. Now, that always struck me as a strange notion because I was interested enough in politics in 1957, it was my first year out of school, to remember the extraordinary breakthrough of the Japan-Australia Commerce Agreement. This was only 12 years after World War II. And this was only 12 years after many Australians, some of them on both sides of politics in Australia, John Carrick and Tom Uren, different sides, Red Swartz, the great member for what was then called Darling Downs in Queensland, now called Groom. We put all of that aside and we forged this agreement with Japan in 1957. And that was the true point of entry of Australia into trading relations with Asia. That mattered far more than anything that was done by a subsequent government. And do you know what the Labor Party in opposition did? They voted against it because they were told by the manufacturing unions of Australia that it would do damage to manufacturing jobs. Of course, it helped expand job opportunities enormously. And when I think of Menzies, I think of his contribution to national security, and I think of the contribution that Prime Ministers who came after him also made. And I also, when I reflect on his tremendous contribution and tremendous leadership, I think of what he did to bind up wounds and heal division in his own country on very important issues. When Menzies retired at his last press conference, he was asked what were the two things of which he was really proud. And he said, what I did for education and the coalition I had with the Country Party. They were the two things. What he did for education was twofold. He did enormous things for tertiary education. The Murray Inquiry, the making available of enormous opportunities for people who didn't have the opportunity before then to aspire to a university education. The other thing he did, of course, was to end 100 years of discrimination against the Catholic community of Australia when he cut through on state aid, an intensely divisive issue. For 100 years, 20% of our population's education at a primary and secondary level had been sustained out of the pockets of arguably a somewhat poorer section of the Australian community. And he did that because he believed in a fundamental principle that good education should be available for all. And he believed even more importantly in parental choice. I mean, I'm a product totally of a state government education, and I'm very grateful to the New South Wales education system for the education that I received. But I've also believed very strongly in the right of parental choice, and it never ceased to amaze my friend George Bush when he was President of the United States. We talked about education when I told him that 34% of Australian school-aged children are educated in the non-government sector. And that was, of course, made possible by the efforts of many parents, many of whom struggled to afford it, but because they wanted it for their children, and others in the community who could afford it, but nonetheless relieved the state of an enormous burden. Now, Menzies was a healer as well as being a strong leader. He led, of course, the Liberal Party for a record period of time. And during his time as leader, he oversaw, I might say, with some memorable phrases such as the 36 faceless men. Some memorable phrase. He oversaw the internal disarray in the Labor Party after Dr. Evatt's intense disappointment at losing the election of 1954. Menzies understood what had gone wrong when he first led the party. You should always learn your lessons from past mistakes and failures. I had plenty of mistakes and failures in my years, I hope in different ways. But Menzies epitomised the importance of teamwork. When I look back on that period, I think of the close relationship he had with Arthur Fadden and John McEwen. McEwen was a great figure. He was a terrible protectionist. He was. I mean, the true story of the argument between McEwen and McMahon is really that McMahon was a free trader and McEwen was a protectionist. But leave that aside. He was a great ally of Bob Menzies. He stood strongly behind him on national security issues and was a respected figure around the world. But he believed very passionately, Menzies did, in the coalition. So did Malcolm Fraser. I was deeply impressed with Fraser's commitment to the coalition. And I found myself, when it was my privilege to be Prime Minister, the relationship I had with Tim Fischer, John Anderson and Mark Vaile was a relationship of total trust and a determined cooperation into the future. And it's a lesson we should take from those years. We've got to work with our friends in the National Party. I know there are some differences around the states. I'm a little aware of that. I know in some states you can sort of be a member of both and nobody cares. In other states, if you dare to think of being a member of the other, a lot of people care. But I put that to one side. But I think of my own experience, and I had a wonderful team. Some of them are here tonight. I've seen Richard Alston and Michael Woolridge. But I want to pay particular tribute to two people who aren't here tonight. One of them is Peter Costello. In my view, the very best treasurer that this country's had. We had a great partnership as Prime Minister and Treasurer. It's always the role of a Treasurer to stop a Prime Minister spending everything he wants to, and all Prime Ministers occasionally like to do that. I don't think I was as bad as a lot of others, but I mean, leave that aside. But he was there, he understood. He pioneered many things. Charter of Budget Honesty, and of course the Future Fund. And I salute him, I thank him, and I pay tribute to his contribution. Alexander Downer, whose magnificent daughter, Georgina, is here tonight, who was Australia's longest-serving Foreign Minister, as Peter was our longest-serving Treasurer. Isn't it interesting, the three important offices of state, Prime Minister, Treasurer and Foreign Minister, were held by the same people for the entirety of the government. Now that says something I mean, I don't want it repeated in the present government, let me say. I don't think I want any of those three to Penny Wong, Anthony Albanese and Dr. Jim Chalmers to remain any longer than the next election. But that stability and that contribution, particularly but not only of those three, is quite remarkable. I also want to very genuinely acknowledge the massive contribution that many state leaders have made to the resilience and strength of our parties. I found, particularly in the early years as a minister and then opposition leader, you couldn't go anywhere in Victoria without being reminded of that remarkable man, Henry Bolte, who was a great state premier. And I think also of the remarkable Court family from Western Australia and the other premiers who are here tonight. And I congratulate the Premier of Tasmania on winning and remaining the one government leader. We hope that'll change in the future in the best of all ways. And while I'm acknowledging people, there's one person who I do want to particularly honour because he made a great contribution towards my understanding of politics, and that's the late John Carrick. John was for many years the General Secretary or Director of the New South Wales Division of the Liberal Party. He'd been a prisoner of war. He'd been forced to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway. He'd endured all of those privations but came back to Australia imbued with a determination to work on the beginnings of the Liberal Party that had been formed just before he returned. I learnt more about politics from John. I learnt most particularly that politics is a battle of ideas, not a public relations contest, and I honour him. Now that's a sense all in the past. I just want to say two things quickly about the future. I want to say to you, Peter, you've had a terrific week. Peter Dutton. You have made the weather politically. You haven't negotiated the weather, you've made it. And that is a remarkable achievement. I saw our Prime Minister on television just before I came to this dinner. He seemed a bit, I don't know if it's the right word, but it's a good one, discombobulated. He didn't seem to quite know what had hit him. And he was answering a question from a journalist who criticised, by implication, the use by the Labor Party of memes and cartoons. And he said to the journalist, because he didn't really have an answer, he said, "Oh, you should loosen up." I would say to the Prime Minister, he should wise up because he's got a big fight on his hands. Nobody in this room knows more than Peter does the task that lies ahead. We've only had one-term government since Federation, and that was the Scullin government in 1931. It's a huge task. But gee, I think Peter's made a tremendous start. And that announcement this week had the hallmarks of thought, research, and most of all, political courage. And that is a very, very valuable thing indeed. I can't let an occasion like this go by without saying how appalled I have been as an Australian, as somebody who's always had a very warm association with the Jewish community of this country and an enduring respect for the State of Israel, the appalling way in which our Prime Minister has dropped the ball on the issue of anti-Semitism in our nation. I don't need to remind you of the history of the darkest moments of mankind's march, at the hands of the Nazis. I think very, very sincerely that if after the 7th of October the Prime Minister had made it very clear that as far as he was concerned, he would link arms with other political leaders in Australia to denounce the emergence of any semblance of anti-Semitism in our ranks. But his failure to do that gave licence, a head nod, to organisations who harbour those bigoted sentiments only a little beneath the surface. Now, I think he stands very heavily condemned for that. Tonight, my friends, we give thanks to those who have gone before us. I want to join John and Peter in thanking our donors. Many are here tonight. I know many of them well. They've been terrific. And it's pretty hard when you don't have many friends. And we had tonight the people who were there all the time. You know, there are plenty of people out there who sort of, my late brother used to say, when John's doing well, they run across the road to shake your hand. And when John's not doing so well, they run across the road to avoid shaking your hand. And we've got the people here tonight who just always stuck by us. And I want to thank them very, very warmly. I want to thank the rank and file of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party displayed enormous loyalty towards me. There were times when you couldn't give me away. And they stuck to me. But to you, Peter, you were a great minister. You made a triumphal entry into Parliament. You defeated, I think, the former leader of the Australian Democrats, Cheryl Kerner, seat of Dixon. That was pretty good. And you impressed an enormous... And I thought the way in which you handled the Indigenous referendum was terrific. That should always have gone down, and gone down heavily. But there are a lot of people who were equivocal about it. And I think you showed enormous skill in picking and reading the room, picking the attitude of the Australian public. And in the end, it was defeated by an even bigger margin than our more pessimistic, views suggested. You were a great minister in an earlier government. And I hope, as I know every person in this room hopes, that your greatest years in politics lie before you. But it will only happen if we all work together. And it will only happen if we maintain our coalition with the National Party, and importantly, if we continue to display sensible boldness on policy. Our supporters want us to stand for things. And what they like about you, Peter, is you do stand for things. They know what you believe in. They know you have the courage and the strength to achieve it. And with a very good team around you, with the goodwill and good wishes of former occupants of high office, but most importantly, the men and women. Isn't that a great Labor expression, men and women? And I think it's very appropriate for this. And with the support of the men and women of the Liberal Party, you'll do it. And we can look forward to a return of some of the great years of Liberal rule in the past. Thank you.
Authorised A. Hurst, Liberal Party, Canberra.